So good evening. I'm Naqiya Shiraz, and welcome to the second episode of Advocata's AdvoChats. So this is going to be a recurring live series of discussions that Advocata has designed, where we want to discuss current economic conversations, and those are the kinds of things we want to tackle in this series today. So that being said, we would like to encourage everybody who's joining in today to initiate the conversation as much as you can. Please ask your questions and take part in these much needed conversations. Please, you can send in your questions via the questions button at the bottom near the chat pad. But if you don't have that option, please send in your questions in the comment section and we'll take it up during the conversation. So in today's session, What's Up with Food Prices? I would like to introduce Mr. Charitha Subasinghe, who's here today. He's the president of retail at JOHN KEELLS HOLDINGS. And we would also like to say hello to Rehana Thowfeek. She's an economic researcher and blogger, and at present she works for a US-based food technology company as a researcher. Thank you both for joining us today in today's discussion.
Hi, Naqiya. Hi, Charitha.
Hi, Rehana.
To start things off, while we get a few questions, I'd like to so there's been a lot of conversation around inflation and the topic of inflation lately, and inflation, according to the NCPI, increase was 6% last month. Food inflation has been even higher. And in line with that, Advocata's butt curry indicator, which kind of tracks these retail prices of a certain commonly consumed goods, has also seen an increase of about 30% since August 2020 till 2021. So much of these increases are, of course, due to several factors, both global and due to certain policy decisions that have been happening locally at home. So the first question I'd like to pose to both of you is, in terms of consumer and consumer behaviors, what have your experiences been like, and the changes that you've seen in consumer behavior in your relative fields?
Rehana, you want to go first, or you want me to?
No, you go ahead, Charitha.
Well, basically, I think just let's set the context before we come to Sri Lanka. I think what has been seen world over today is that there has been a significant increase in food cost world over, and that is predominantly because of the pandemic. And what they say is that the main reasons are, one thing is from one side, the productivity of the farms have reduced with the pandemic, lockdowns, all that. Then the transportation cost, the freight cost has gone up. Freight cost has gone up as much as 6 times as before. That is also related to certain ports not functioning productively as before. And of course, the climate change also having an impact. So that is basically the headline world over on food inflation. And to the extent, I think what they say is that any government in power today are not very popular at all. So that is the overall context of the what the pandemic has also done to the world economy, world food inflation. And if you take Sri Lanka today, in addition to what is happening world over, is also impacted with the foreign exchange issues that we are having, the rupee devaluation, which is additionally adding to the pandemic situation as well. And we looked at what is sold on our shelf, and when we looked at what is sold on our shelf, we found that about 30% of all the SKUs, the stock keeping units which are on the shelf, is produced purely with raw material produced within the country. That's 30%. 35% is with some element of imported items involved in that production, and the balance 35% is totally imported items. So you could see what is happening with the commodity prices going up world over has a certain implication on almost 70% of what is on the shelf. And in addition to that comes the fact that our Sri Lankan foreign currency issue as well as the exchange rate issues are having further implications. What has happened today, based on that, your question about what I've seen with the consumer, is that I think to some extent the actual consumption is also not at a normal stage because of the different lockdowns and situations that has happened. So starting from last March onwards, we have had about 3 and this is the 4th proper lockdown. And also when that happens is that one thing is when there is no lockdown, there's a panic buying where people go and purchase whatever is available with the intention of managing the lockdown situation. And in a lockdown situation, you have a suppressed consumption during a lockdown because of the fact that you can't go into the markets and purchase whatever. So I don't think we have really seen the settling down of the new norm in consumption. But of course, what has happened inevitably is the fact that you're right. We have seen prices going up. As a retailer, we see almost on a daily basis price increases coming from both the manufacturer as well as the other items. And I think food inflation today is well over the 10% mark today overall. So answering very shortly what has happened, we can still see simply because of the disruption in the lockdown and the type of consumption has not settled down. But we think finally with the inflation at that high, that there will be a certain curtailing of the consumption and changes in the consumption patterns when a certain normalcy also comes in.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mr. Charitha. Yes, Rehana, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with what Charitha said. I think obviously the global supply issue would definitely impact Sri Lanka as well, because we do rely quite a lot on imported products, both for direct consumption as well as, in our manufacturing process. And in addition to that, there have been like a more very country-specific issues like the import controls and the exchange rate issue that has sort of, made it a little bit worse for where. And in terms of consumer behavior, I think absolutely we haven't like sort of settled down into a pattern as yet. And I think as we emerge out of COVID, hopefully soon, we might be able to get a better gauge of, how exactly consumer patterns, sort of consumption patterns have been impacted by, like sustained job loss and income loss.
Of course. Thank you, Rehana. And a kind of follow-up question to something that both of you guys mentioned. So with the foreign currency shortages and these repetitive waves of import restrictions that we've been seeing as a result of the pandemic, just over a week ago, there was a new order made by the central bank to license commercial banks where they can't open LCs to some 623 HS codes. Unless the LC is covered by like 100% cash margin deposit. So have these restrictions affected your supply chains? Like, what's your take on how these kinds of policies will affect traders and prices alike?
A few things that will happen is that one thing is that if you look at why the central bank went ahead with the 100% margin, was that if you look at the couple of things that did happen last week, was that there was the central bank having a certain rate as well as the banks having a market-driven rate. And firstly, the central bank wanted the banks to be in line with the central bank rate. But what thereafter, what happened was, I guess, there was going to also be a certain scarcity of exchange, because the exporters would not want to convert it into rupees at the rate, while they'll be wanting the better rate. And then the second step that happened was that bringing that 100% margin into play was with the intention of trying to manage the whatever the exchange that was available. Both, I personally feel, will be not sustainable for a long period of time, simply because a correct exchange rate would need to come into play, as well as there has to be, otherwise it will come to absolute grinding halt. Today, one of the biggest challenges for any importer is firstly getting an LC open, where the bank has to guarantee the final payment. The banks would also be worried about being able to retire the LC at the right time, and their fear is having the dollars with them. Then comes there are certain issues like when you're going to send a TT subsequently from getting the items into the country, there are certain issues at the time of clearing the goods where the necessary payment has not gone through, and there are certain stocks that is lying there. So it is a difficult situation that we are all facing, and unfortunately it is not only the so-called luxury item. If you consider, let's say, cheese, for example, or apple, or pears, or whatever as luxury, but it's beyond that. You would have seen on news where even things like garlic was getting stuck, not being able to clear. So you will not, I guess we will not be able to say that it's only the luxury items that will get impacted, but some item in that entire food chain will have certain implications as well due to this problem.
Of course. Rehana, is there anything that you'd like to add to that? Or
no, we can go to the next question.
Sure. I'd just like to remind the audience to please send in any questions that you have into the chat box below, and we will take them up as the conversation goes on. So, Mr. Charitha, another kind of question that that I would like to ask is regarding, again, regarding the shortages, foreign currency shortages. So the CAA recently also set price controls on a lot of products like sugar and rice recently. So what have your experiences been currently and in the past onto how these price controls have affected businesses? As a retail specialist, what is your kind of take for this kind of policy for the long term?
I think price control is not a sustainable tool that can be used, simply because it is a short-term thing. Further, if you look at even it doesn't incentivize a producer, nor a manufacturer or a farmer for that matter, when a price control comes into play. Now, for example, the rice price control that was brought in meant finally the farmer who could have possibly got a few rupees more for his paddy not being able to achieve it, while the market terms where the millers possibly were willing to pay something more, a few 10 or 15 rupees more for their paddy, but with the intention of bringing price control at the final end to the consumer, that entire chain became to some extent inefficient, where basically the farmer finally was told, here you can't keep more than so much for your paddy.
I'm so sorry, Mr. Subasinghe, sorry for disturbing you, but I feel like there's some people can't hear you all that
right.
well. If you could bring, yes.
Would this be okay? Do you think now it's okay?
I think that's a little bit better.
Better.
Yeah,
Fine.
I think that's a bit better. Thank you.
So I think it is a very inefficient way, price control, simply because it doesn't incentivize the farmer, not the manufacturer, to produce according to the requirement. Simply because, let's say the farmer, so now let's say when a control comes in and based on that, he's told that he can't get more than a certain value for his paddy, then he will curtail his farming activity, and that means your production comes down, then that leads to scarcity, and then the price per what is available goes up. So it brings a very vicious cycle to this entire thing. So I don't think price control is something that should be used, because it leads to a little short-termish way of managing, because if finally, for example, for prices to come down, the production has to be higher. That leads to more supply, and the market forces will decide on the final price for that product. So price control in that context, I don't think is the right way to go. But again, if you then look at what happened with the sugar situation, where if you take that, unfortunately, and if you look at, let's say, what happened about 6 months ago, that when the taxes came down from 50 rupees for that custom tax, came down to 25 cents, a certain significant amount of sugar was brought into the country. And if you look at what prompted the government to do, to create that essential service commissioner and to take the stocks in, was that the prices went up over 200 rupees, where I mean, there was no reason for the prices to have shot up to that figure, simply because it was sugar that was brought 6 months ago, and the cost may have been less than even 100 rupees. So then there was a price control needed. So unfortunately, also, whilst we say that the pandemic situation world over is causing the commodities to go up, there are also world over certain suppliers and manufacturers who are using this opportunity also for possibly not for the right reason, for trying to earn a quick buck here and there. So I don't think it's a very black and white situation sometimes. So you will possibly need to use certain tools depending on the situation to manage certain products or situations as such. That's how I would look at it, while predominantly or mostly I will not really encourage price control to become a dominant tool.
I mean, I think I tend to agree with that, your sort of final verdict on it. Price controls, it's also difficult to enforce price controls across the country because, we have seen this historic in the sense, even in the past year, usually when price controls are announced, we usually see almost immediately a shortage in those supplies in the market. So it ends up inconveniencing the consumer end of the day. And I think also the fact that it sort of impedes the natural demand and supply process. And sometimes these price the price ceiling that's determined by the government may not necessarily reflect the actual, the input cost and the raw material cost. So as Charitha said, it definitely may not sometimes be incentivizing producers and even distributors to, actually get the product and put it onto the shelves. So again, I completely agree that I don't think it's a long-term or a very sustainable solution.
Rehana, I was also thinking, Rehana, maybe your thoughts on that as well, is that now a product, let's say for example, let's take for example rice for that matter. Let's take an example. Possibly, rather than a price control, now what happens is that rice, possibly, I'm not being trying to be snobbish here or whatever, but rice, there might be sometimes a person or a consumer who might be willing to pay something more. While there is also, we know the poorer, the SCC type of customer who could not afford that. The question is then is it now, we are at the moment subsidizing the inputs, whether it's fertilizer subsidies or whatever, just to retain that pricing at a certain price. Question is that the efficient way to handle it? Or let the market conditions decide on the right price, but subsidize that the population who can't afford, so that you subsidize that input or the output for that particular crowd, so that the people who are to some extent being able to afford at a higher price will pay that price, so that you avoid the scarcity and possibly you're also managing your subsidies in a different way to satisfy a sort of a safety net for that certain people who cannot afford. I'm also just trying to figure out how do you manage it, because price control overall becomes so inefficient and leads to, and also what has happened is that when price controls, inevitably you find that either one thing is scarcity or there's a blatant violation of the price control as well, simply because you can't afford to sell at that price as well. So a different mechanism to manage that group of population who cannot afford, and see how you manage that might be another option in a situation like this.
I mean, I don't see why that wouldn't work. I suppose that would have to come from suppose a rice producer. I suppose they could build two different brands, like a more premium version and a normal version which would be at, well, I wouldn't say subsidized, but not at a premium amount, but which would be more affordable for the masses.
Yeah.
So I mean that's a possible solution to the situation we are in. I suppose if we get into if the government should subsidize or not, I guess we are going into kind of a murky, does the government have the sort of fiscal space to do that? Because even at the moment we are seeing that actually it's a very constrained fiscal space that we have. So I definitely think there are workarounds. We can, maybe allocate some of the government expenditure for this in a more sort of efficient way, or we can think about how, individual producers themselves can market to two separate segments rather than marketing one product to all segments.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think we had a few questions regarding some of the things that we just spoke about as well. Price controls means creating market distortions, but under COVID pandemic, what strategies you could propose? And I think the both of you kind of touched on the different solutions. And of course, it is a long-term problem and it has no easy decision, but I think you kind of touched on it. If there isn't anything else that you'd like to
yeah, I mean, as Charitha said, I think in the long term, we need to focus on improving sort of the efficiency of production and the total production as well, because that's the only way we are going to have to manage the price levels. We can't, cater to the demand with a low supply, because naturally the price is going to be higher then. So it's definitely going to have to come from a supply, push from supply.
Definitely, Rehana. And I think following up on this whole supply point that you mentioned, there've also been certain raids carried out in terms of identifying stocks of rice and sugar across the country to kind of ease the pressure on these shortages in the markets. And people are dismissing the rise in prices as temporary as a result of hoarding. That these won't last long, right? So we know there is some hoarding, but is it the only driver of these prices, or what would your take on that be?
Yeah, so if you take sugar, I think what when they worked out the quantity that was available with the different warehouses, when they worked it out, it was like about 3 months of stocks that was there. So that is what is getting distributed to the market today. And I believe we will have to go in for, again, imports of sugar. And what would possibly happen is that if you import today, you will not be able to sell it at the price that is been stipulated now. I think it's about 125 rupees is the final selling price for sugar today. But that will be like stocks for about 3 months, and when you start importing, it will have to be at a higher price. Rice, I'm not too sure what the total stocks, the buffer stocks that we have today. And I know that the next harvest will be due towards in a few months' time, and that by that time the prices would need to fluctuate as well. So the prices that had been established recently is more to do with the stocks in hand, and the question is how much stocks is available, and thereafter it will have to vary accordingly. So that is how I would answer that question today of the if it's rice and sugar.
Thank you, Mr. Charitha. And another question has come up on how is the uptake on online sales been? What products have been demanded more? If you could answer that question.
Yeah, so let me talk about what happened during the first wave was that we were all caught without having any answer at all. And we disappointed the entire customer base. But over a period of time, we have improved, so has different other online partners as well. And today, if you look at it, if March 2020 was a lockdown, where there people are screaming, look here, I don't have anything to eat or whatever, and everyone is letting me down. Today, I don't see that happen. In terms of online also, since then, what if I will be very specific, the Keels online is that when we, the little bits that we did in March 2020 was a very restricted range that we carried online. But today, the entire range that is physically available in the store, anyone can go and order. In terms of the number of orders also, we cater to about good 15 to 20,000 on a daily basis online. And that is the type of number that we are having. So if I'm to answer, that has been the road that we have had over the last 12 months. And if you look at, and if the question, if a leading question from that is that, have you seen a behavioral change of the consumer moving into more online? Are they more comfortable? Yes. And even during between lockdowns, the norm that settles in is significantly much more than what it was before the pre-COVID. Pre-COVID, our online site, for example, was less than 100 a day. But during normalized period, when even during the lockdown is not there, we settle it at about 4,000 to 5,000 orders. So you see a lot of people. So again, it's those are the positives that the pandemic has also given, where more digitization has happened, more people are getting used to it, as well as the companies also investing in a different reliable omni-channel strategy as well. So that is what has happened overall, and I think those are the positives that we can take.
Just want to ask, Charitha, did you notice any dip in sales, or actually did you all notice an increase in sales? How does online orders compare to sort of normal, brick and mortar shopping? Like,
Rehana, it is still significantly higher when you have a outlet open. So if you look at it, Rehana, if you look at a lockdown period and a period where you can freely move around. During a lockdown period, we do on a daily basis about 50% of the normal sale. So it doesn't still compensate for a brick and mortar sale. But what has happened is that you're able to move with the consumer convenience factor as well, and that brings loyalty. Where if you have a reliable omni-channel strategy available, you retain the loyalty for your brand. So, for example, if you in the morning get up and decide on a normal day, where you can freely move around or well, you don't feel like walking into a store and shop. Can I have a different option? And if you have a reliable online option, then that customer will go to your Keel site and do your shopping. But if you didn't have it, they look at a different other online shopper or online channel to do their shopping from. So effectively, you're sort of moving in line with the lifestyle of the consumer and having an option also available, but it doesn't compensate for totally to a brick and mortar sale.
Yeah, I think I, agree with that based on my own personal experience, because normally when you're, pushing a cart through the aisles, your eyes generally go to different products, and then you see, you tend to buy sometimes things that you don't need either, which which is a lot harder in the online
Yeah.
sphere. So
And
that,
also,
you have a list, you go
also
and look at what I need, and then
and as a retailer also, we would want you to go down the aisle simply because then you have that impulse buying happening. But we
yes,
see is
I
that
think you have
because
a higher share of wallet to them, right?
yeah, because on an online platform, it's a very rational shopping behavior you'll have.
Yeah.
You know what exactly you want and you go and buy them.
Mm.
While on a when you go to a brick and mortar and you're moving around with a thing, you'll see something new. You'll start picking it up, trialing out to whatever. So we'll possibly love to have you inside the shop rather than curtailing your shopping on an online
Yes,
platform.
and I think it might even affect new products that are coming into the market, or new producers or new brands, because they won't have that same visibility that
No,
existing
no,
brands would have.
no. You're perfectly right there.
Thank you so much for that. And kind of in line with what Rehana also mentioned, so this idea of how the industry is also kind of changing because of this all online demand increasing. What would you say is your outlook for 2022 in terms of stocks and prices and sales?
I think 2022 will also be a difficult year on pricing, simply because, let's say, even the new norm after the pandemic also, you'll find that it will take a while for things to settle down from a global perspective, and also, unfortunately, our current situation in the country with forex to all that will also possibly need a bit more time until some permanent or a midterm solution is found. So in that context, 2022 could also be, I don't want to be a prophet of doom here, but I think it's something that I don't think it will be too rosy as well.
Just to kind of touch on some of the questions that we've been getting. We have a question on how the supplies of keels have been adapting with price controls and how it affects the overall operations of modern trade and in general trade.
So I think modern trade is, or even on even modern trade for a consumer, you need to have the consumer option availability is a must. Where you walk into a store and you need to have that the brands that you want to have, because you have also got used to a certain consumption pattern to all that as well. So what this price control would happen is that some brands will go off the shelf simply because that manufacturer or whoever or the distributor in terms of the importer who sells it will not be able to sell at the control price. So that's going to be an unfortunate situation where the consumer's choice to some extent is going to get impacted. And how it will also impact us in terms of our logistics part is that how do you then handle bring in a substitute product to manage to satisfy the consumer demand. So that means a lot of inefficiencies simply because, let's say, what would have happened is that you will want to have not more than one or two brands, for example, simply because the logistic handling of a large portfolio of products becomes very inefficient. So now what would happen is that if you're not sure of a particular brand being available for a extended period of time, then to manage that you need to have the second and third brands also available to manage a situation like that. That leads a lot of inefficiencies in this entire logistic and retailing part. So that is where it is coming. So to one side, the consumer is going to be inconvenienced because he will not have the choice. And from a retail point of view, the cost of managing the inventory is going to be much greater. One thing, as I mentioned, you will have to have 2 or 3 brands. And also on the other side is that you will have to carry a larger stock because the lead times may not be as sharp as before. And therefore, you will have to have a bigger buffer with you as well to manage any disruptions in the logistics part as well.
Right. I hope that question was answered. Thank you so much. It was very, very clear explanation. We have another question here about what about importing goods what about importing goods like sugar, milk powder, and all? If they don't import, what sort of issue will happen in Sri Lanka in the future? In I think the question is trying to ask what would probably be the
I think the problem would be if there is a certain control price, a sort of a determined control price at which an importer will not, where it won't be viable for the importer to bring it and sell it. I believe there is a bit of an impasse in the milk powder category at the moment, where the milk powder manufacturer is requesting for a price increase and they have not been able to get it. So what it would mean is that any organization will not want to be losing money, and in that context, they will want to mitigate their losses. How they will mitigate is would differ, and based on that, there will be issues of that nature. But I think to a great extent, if there are no control prices, the different importers will find their own ways of managing whether it's the exchange or whatever, and managing to import it and sell it. But of course, there will be a certain cost increase to whatever, but that is, I think, would happen. So I think the worst part in a situation of this is a price control that will not be feasible for a person to import and sell. I guess that is where the bigger problem will be.
Right. Thank you. I think we have a few more questions. Here's a question in terms of if the scarcity for milk powder, rice, etc., if it's genuine, if it's a genuine scarcity in the market. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not too sure about the gas situation because we do not get involved in the retailing part of it. But the milk powder is a situation. Honestly, I do not know who's right or wrong, but simply because I try to stock the milk powder, and when I speak to milk powder suppliers to get the requirement that is needed, what they say is that, look here, I'm losing money in this entire operation, and therefore I can't produce according to the demand, but I will produce based on how much I can afford to lose. Type of situation. Honestly, I do not know the numbers to whatever to all that, but that is what has been said. Gas, of course, I'm totally that area. I have no idea whatsoever. But various conversations I hear only on the media part of it.
Yeah, I think the scarcity of a lot of the essential items. One is probably because of the price controls, because some sellers don't want to sell it, at the price control amount because they are not able to make a profit or make as much of a profit as they normally would. And I think the other end is the issue with actually importing the necessary stocks, because at the end of the day, we do rely quite a lot on imported stocks, and we can't meet domestic demand with the domestic supply. So there has to be an imported component. So I think even though the import bans came, in last year and then sort of amplified over the course of the year, there were, generally these are bought in huge, bulk quantities. So it would have, there would have been some warehouse stocks that, can sort of pan out over the couple of sort of the months. But I think now we've come to a point where those buffer stocks are also probably running out. And then that import, the issue with opening letter of credit and the issue with the dollar, I think that's also part of the issue. And I think depending on what happens to the exchange rate in the future, obviously that's going to increase the prices for consumers. I think regardless of the exchange rate, anyway, it will increase because of the global, the supply issue. But definitely, I think if the exchange rate bounces up, then we might see sort of an increase in prices. And but if we just allow normal market forces to work, then obviously some amount of demand would come down, and then we will be able to regulate the price to a certain extent. But I think the price control plus the importing issue is compounding the scarcity factor in the country at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Rehana. And also, we have a question regarding the fertilizer issue that we've had in the country. So, how will the current fertilizer issue affect the food supply chains?
Our chain works with about 4,000 farmers, and we have about 8 collection centers across the island. We buy about 30,000 metric tons of vegetables and fruits on an annual basis, and we spend about 4,000 million, 4 billion rupees of we pay the different farmers to buy their crops. So when we talk with the farmers over the last few months, is that initially when the fertilizer ban came into place, there was a big worry that by now we would have run out of fertilizer and there would be a scarcity in the market when it came to vegetables and fruits. But now we understand, speaking with our farmers, that they still have the chemical fertilizer available with them till March or so, and they can manage. So I don't think we have seen the impact of the fertilizer as at now. But of course, what has happened is that similar case as what happened with sugar is that the fertilizer prices have gone up simply because they whatever they have increased their prices. So the farmer today is buying at a higher price. I think when you talk about the fertilizer aspect, is that I think the objective is right, that the fact that we need to go into a more environmental friendly agriculture practice to whatever. Unfortunately, what has happened also over the years is that we have overused. We have overused our fertilizer, pesticide, and unfortunately, that is also coming from possibly the wrong advice or probably things of that nature, and that has also caused unnecessary issues in our agriculture practices. The question is that is this the right time to do something like a change like that and adaptation to a new method in a pandemic situation? Is it right, or could it be postponed? Possibly is the question that is there. But one thing is that I think working with these parties, what we also see that unfortunately, now if you take the Sri Lankan farmer, about 27% of the population is in farming in some form or shape. Then even if you come to the paddy farming, there are about 2 million of the Sri Lanka involved in that farming. The question is that, unfortunately, have we given enough recognition for what they are put in, and whether finally, because of the different policies, whether we end up with a policy that is not really helping that cause of sustaining that population. Because today, if you look at it, we'll have a huge social issue if, for example, that population cannot sustain in farming, and what are the other options that we have? We don't have industrialization where they can go into a different industry or whatever, and therefore there's a huge thing that unfortunately we have not given enough recognition for. And how do we ensure that farmers' lifestyle also improves? Now, if you look at 40 years ago, when in my social studies class, for example, if I had to draw a farmer, I would draw him with the mammoth on on his shoulder and walk in to whatever. But today, if I ask my 11-year daughter to draw a farmer, it is almost unfortunately the same farmer that we are drawing. So their lifestyles have also not improved. So my question is that when we are making a policy change, are we doing that with some thinking, a vision of improving something, or is it going to be something that cannot be sustained? I think those are the questions that we may need to answer. I think in the short term, we may sort out something, but the long term, I think with climate change to all that was happening, the bigger challenge with us is that productivity. The 700,000 hectares of paddy that we are cultivating today to cater to this 21 million population, with the climate change and all that, how do you maximize on the yield of that 700,000 hectares? And how also on the other side, if that 22 million population of farmers who are doing paddy cultivation halves, then who's going to cultivate the 700,000 hectares? Would that come down? I think those are pertinent questions that we need to look at and have a plan of managing, or it's going to be a much bigger problem in time to come, where food security to all that also is going to get impacted. I think we are blessed as a country. We are blessed today simply because we have had a lot of resources, much more than some of the other countries, because of the water or land and people involved, and even a little and not having a very clear-cut policy, ad hoc policy, still we have managed simply because of the resources that we have. But this, we can't take that into account, and that is going to get impacted with climate change to all that. So all that would need to be looked at collectively when taking decisions. But I think the thinking is right, organic to whatever is right. But the entire, how it impacts all those little elements would need to also be considered as well.
Yeah, I think definitely on the organic policy, even though in terms of health and climate, it is, it is something needed and something we have to move towards. But whether it can be done, overnight, or whether it can be done even in a year, because all the sort of the existing research points towards like at least a 10 or 15 year a transformation period. And I think you had a very pertinent point on the sort of the standard of living of the farmers and their families, because if you take a country like say America, they have a very industrialized agriculture and farming industry, which obviously has its own issues now, because they are like they have a lot of issues in terms of the emissions, stuff like that. But I think farmers are more sort of empowered and more sort of market driven than the farming community in Sri Lanka, because they are very reliant on say government policy. So if you take America now, maybe not a lot, but a handful of farmers and producers are moving towards organic production, because they are starting to themselves realize that there is an environmental issue and there is a certain consumer behavior, and the demand for these types of products are increasing. So you see a lot of like organic farming coming from from the farmer itself, and it's not something that's driven to them or pushed at them, but it's something that they themselves are sort of empowered and carrying forward. So I think we have a long way to go in that aspect in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Thank you for that really great explanation. And on top of that, the great questions that I think we need to ask going forth as well. We have another question on one of Keel's brand promises is availability of product variety. So how has the current import restrictions affected that brand?
It is impacting quite a bit. Very honestly, it is. And we have looked at different means of managing it, including doing our own direct imports on certain important categories if it is going off the market to manage it. And that is something that our commercial team is working on a daily basis, looking at how do we still maintain that availability part of it. Simply because, again, while there are also the disruptions, there is also a certain discerning customer base also who still will have the ability to purchase that range even at a higher cost. So it is important that we have that choice for the customer as well. So that is something that we are focused on to manage that as well.
Yeah, I think the modern market is not very, very conducive environment for things like import controls and brand sort of price controls, because the consumer is, I mean, it's a free market, right? Producers and say even retailers, they know what they want to market. Consumers know what they want to buy. They have, a pattern of, choosing whether they want to buy this brand or that brand or this product. They know the prices. So I think like we tend to compare this current period with the 70s, but I think in the 70s we are coming from, a closed economy. There were very limited products. Consumers were not used to sort of picking and choosing what they wanted to buy, but now it's completely different. There's, supermarkets are at every 500 yards you get a supermarket. Consumers have become used to it. So I think, sort of trying to have, controlling what goes in the shelves or controlling what price can be charged. I think that's really going to disrupt sort of the modern consumer and even the modern businesses, which are very used to sort of, making their own free choices.
You're spot on there, Rehana, because I think the Sri Lankan consumer today is more exposed to a lot of brands. They have traveled and they know what they want, and you can't curtail their requirement, and it's not the right thing as well.
Completely agree.
Actually, in line with the kind of conversation we're having, we have a question on: have you seen the size of the shopping basket changing? Also, change in composition, perhaps like more essential and less luxuries, given all the issues that we've been talking about today.
I think it was one of our first questions where how we said was that there have been so much disruptions with lockdowns and normal life. We haven't really seen the final, the new norm. But I think there will be certain curtailing of certain, it finally boils down to how much you can afford on food and how are you going to manage it. So I guess when that rational conversation happens, you will see a lot of these products that possibly they can live without, not getting into the basket as well. So that is bound to happen, but of course we, because of the disruptions as I mentioned, we have not seen the new norm yet.
And also another question that came up is in regard to, again, imports and funding import orders. Is there been any issues having to place the collateral in US dollars?
I think it just came about a week ago. I don't think we have still seen how it will pan out over the next few weeks or months. But I feel it may not be sustainable for a long period of time without having some significant issues. So I hope that it will be a short-termish type of thing until a more sustainable solution can be found.
Thank you. I hope the questions have been answered. I think we have like a few minutes more there's also another question on increase in the guaranteed price of paddy from rupees 50 to 60. If you have an opinion on the rationale behind it.
I think I mentioned was that we have always been looking from a point of what the final price should be and trying to suppress the paddy thing. And it has not been very fair to the farmer, simply because I was listening to an interview recently where the farmer said, look here, the miller at the moment is willing to pay me something more. and why are you telling me to sell at a lesser price? So, so those are the conversations I think we had over the last few minutes on what should be the right price and how the market force should work, and so that we don't discourage the farmer from farming, because that is going to be, that will create a vicious cycle where finally the productivity, the supply will reduce, and that will lead to even much more greater higher prices to whatever. So 50-60, I think it's like this. I think the change should, I think there's a farmer, there's the miller, and there is the final consumer. So even for the miller, for that matter, while I guess the more popular way had been to to find fault with the miller for keeping higher prices, but there must be a certain capital cost he's having, investment, and he's also looking at the recovery. So there must be there would be a certain price that is right for the farmer to maintain himself to all that, then a certain price for the miller, and then the final price. I don't think we have ever had a look at what that price should be, whether the 100 rupees is the right price or 150 rupees. And then I think that conversation, I think, would need to happen to understand what should be the right price for the consumer based on all these people having a sustainable price, which will where they will be able to sustain themselves and invest back into the farming. I mean, today, if the farmer is given a price where he can sustain as well as have some reserves for him to invest back, he may then invest in a technology rather than doing manual labor, and that will lead to more productivity. But today we don't hear of that technology being invested simply because that guy can't afford it. So all that would need to be considered finally, whether the paddy is 50 rupees or 60 or even more, finally for that entire process to happen.
I suppose it finally goes back to that, sort of the conversation we were having earlier about how are we going to improve and increase the supply. Definitely, I think the technology transfer is something that's very key in Sri Lanka. And also, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that like all the markets within the supply chain are not necessarily free, right? There are some sort of areas in the supply chain which are controlled by, a couple of large, entities. So, if we have to consider the fact, what are we going to do to sort of improve the competitiveness or the efficiency and the productivity of this entire supply chain, and not just what we are talking about from the consumer end.
Definitely. I think we could time for one last question. Do you think you would see a slowdown in new supermarkets opening, given that the shift currently is to online shopping?
No. I simply because why I'm saying no is that if you look at modern trade today, it's still only about 15% of the total FMCG business. So 85% is still serviced by the grocery shops, and with the lifestyles changing, you see that people look at convenience and they want the shopping occasion, and in that context, still there is huge opportunity for the brick and mortar to expand. I think this conversation would have been a little different if the modern trade was like 80%, 90% of the entire food distribution mechanism, where then the question is, with digitization, digital e-commerce sites come in, then possibly a boardroom discussion would need to happen. But the fact that it is still at a 15-20% of total FMCG distribution, still there's much more room to grow in. So I can't see of the modern trade expansion reducing in a hurry.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the online customer is a very specific kind of customer from a certain income bracket, a certain socioeconomic bracket, and I don't think a majority of Sri Lankans would fall into that category. A lot of them are still, the types that would walk to the shop and buy the products. So I think I predict that we are kind of quite far away from transforming into that kind of, market.
You're right there, Rehana. On top of that, Rehana, I was on a webinar recently on what is stopping, e-commerce or online shopping for your grocery. One thing they say, especially in, let's say, in our region, when I say our region is us, then India, to all that, is that still our shoppers still prefers to go and have the touch and feel of the product to whatever. So that social interaction to all that still becomes part of your lifestyle. And therefore still you'll opt to have your shopping in a brick and mortar situation, and it's the e-commerce will still be maybe a generation or two behind to make it a dominating shopping occasion, I would think.
Yeah, totally agree. I think some sort of countries, the culture has moved towards that, but I think Sri Lanka is still, we are definitely not that kind of customer. And I not that I necessarily think that, a customer who wants to do e-commerce is better or anything. I think it's just a difference. And, it's a matter of just adapting to and actually knowing who your audience is. And, personally, I prefer shopping like in a brick and mortar place. So definitely prefer it over e-commerce. So, yeah.
Thank God.
And I think on that note, it is a little bit past the time. Thank you so much to the both of you for answering the questions, and more importantly to kind of also kind of getting us to ask the important questions as well as answering them. Thank you to everyone who's joined in today. Advocata will be hosting more live discussions like this under AdvoChats. It'll not only be on Instagram, but it'll be on Facebook and Twitter as well. So please stay tuned by following the Advocata social media pages for more content like this. Thank you so much, Rehana. Thank you so much, Mr. Charitha. Thank you everyone for joining in today. Have a wonderful evening and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naqiya.
Thank you.
Bye.